In this sense, I would argue, following Barnett for endorsers, inward-looking critique is absent. Thirdly, cultural voyeurs of postmodern persuasions are thoroughly critical. But for Barnett, problems lie with their total undermining of all forms of knowledge, to the extent that they deny or underestimate the strength of existing ideologies and of the relationship between knowledge and power. I will suggest in a later section that examples of all these three approaches are discernible in our field of EA, and that these might not be the only roles possible. Meanwhile, for Barnett and some others, being critical no longer necessarily implies a retreat into university spaces, but demands engagement with the wider world through critical action derived from critical knowledge created by staff and students alike. Elsewhere, Ian Stronach declares that no other era of the academy has worn its academic freedom more lightly, nor given it away more readily, referring to well-known legions of carefully conformist educational researchers bent on doing the government's will, even if grudgingly. In response, there is a call for acts of civil courage by those who inhabit academe. And so on to the next layer, which is doctoral education itself. Everyone happy that I continue in this vein?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So, developments in doctoral education reflect pressures towards diversity in research education in the UK. And as David Scott and I point out, the PhD has been supplanted by 4 other kinds of doctorate: the practice-based, the professional, the so-called new route, and PhD by publication. In the UK, EA students are much more likely to be following the PhD and the EdD pathways, and as the previous section suggests, this has been accompanied by a diversification of sites and agents in the production of knowledge. Tayson, for example, argues forcefully in favour of the EdD's potential for enabling practitioners to shape the knowledge claims of and in the field. In brief, and with widespread variations by discipline, the highly specialised academic identity implicit in the idea of doctoral education as initiation into a discipline is being increasingly replaced by fragmentation and variation. This is suggested, I contend, in the A field by blurred boundaries between what constitutes the stuff of leadership development courses and doctoral studies. I'll return to that. Simultaneously, of course, there are direct and indirect attempts by governments to standardise the processes of and outputs arising from doctorates, notably financial inducements and penalties for HE institutions in relation to poor completion rates, inadequate supervisions, and the incorporation of research student outputs into institutional audits, such as research assessment frameworks. Regulation is pervasive and includes sets of generic skills for doctoral education against which AE institutions are held accountable. And as we know, these include timelines for students and supervisors alike, referred to in softer terms as personal development planning, PDP, everyone must have one, and in harder terms as pre-specified transfer points. However, as Scott and Morrison consider, the introduction of diversity is more than a consequence of universities meeting increased demand. It also reflects pressures to modify the doctoral experience. As Scott and Morrison consider, for example, historically, how various reports have expressed concerns about the quality and standards of awards, the narrow and specialised nature of inquiries undertaken by students, the restricted disciplinary orientation of the degree, the individualised and thus non-collaborative nature of the pedagogy employed, the non-transferability of acquired skills, which my reading throughout this year suggests to me strongly is still understood opaquely, and the academic emphasis of the degree with little or no relevance to economic needs. Now, whereas some concerns reflect serious inadequacy, we might argue, others reflect ideological disagreements about the nature of knowledge and a desire to impose a non-disciplinary structure. Thus, recent doctoral reforms are profound insofar as they have threatened, and if we agree with Barnett, they've done so very accurately, hitherto enclosed knowledge structures in UK universities. Cowan, for example, describes the history of the PhD as the bureaucratisation of originality, that the original and largely individual search for a universalising and transcultural knowledge that originated in the university has been circumscribed by bureaucratic procedures that have reconstituted the type of knowledge produced. This extends through doctoral pedagogic sequence, pedagogic relations, and knowledge into training methods, and is accompanied by more emphasis upon instrumental knowledge, not least for particular professional practice. The PhD, which now includes a significant taught element and is thus coming to represent pedagogically the type of doctoral study, the professional doctorate, that it gave rise to. Meanwhile, universities' capacity to erect labour market shelters around their professional doctorates remains limited. In education, we might argue, the acquisition of an Ed.D. has questionable direct promotional or status benefits. Indeed, in the field of EA studies, notably in the UK and the USA, successive governments have sought to bypass university-accredited professional qualifications and create their own. All this suggests that a homogeneous model of doctoral study is misleading and furthermore misconstrues the experience and the doctoral identity that derives from such experiences. This is not to deny that there will be common experiences of doctoral study across sites and agencies. However, and this is where differentiation occurs, Scott and I argue, disciplines which emphasise correct views of knowledge and fixed and agreed procedures for developing that knowledge are also likely to have a particular view about the relationship that should be established between supervisor and student, and about how the student should be positioned. In contrast, in those disciplines which are characterised by a plethora of approaches and which do not have an agreed view of knowledge or of knowledge development procedures, the supervisor-student relationship is likely to be understood differently. It has been suggested that the professional doctorate makes a contribution to practice and that the PhD makes a contribution to the knowledge base of the discipline. Scott and Morrison argue that in one sense this both exaggerates and misconstrues the distinction, yet in part it also reflects the mixed and confused nature of doctorates, in which some PhDs are focused on making a contribution to practice and some professional doctorates are focused on making a contribution to the discipline. The reason for this confusion are not difficult to discern, especially in education, in which the fragmentation deriving from inter as well as multidisciplinary bases proliferates. So doctoral students, I argue, are caught up in a web of disciplinary frameworks in which there is conflict and disagreement. In such worlds, generic doctoral frameworks have limited influence beyond the rhetorical, other than as a means of accountability. For doctoral students, this implies a journey in which an identity is created, mediated, and structured, and is in turn transformed by them by reference to a range of identities that include becoming and surviving. If learning is central to both, then the experience of doctoral learning is also deeply embedded in disciplinary contexts. For professional doctoral students, the prescribed link is to practice, and the assumed mediation between theory and practice is usually, though not exclusively, through engagement with empirical research, commonly of the relatively small scale.